We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm the Community and Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto our interview series, Heidi Rolston. She is the head of people at Descartes Labs. Heidi, thank you so much for being on the show. I would love to, if you would start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, when you were younger?
Yeah, that's always a good question, especially for someone. So hi, I'm Heidi, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And the question of what you want to be when you grow up is always a good one, especially when you're like me and you're kind of coming to the tail end of your career. So you've had a lot of opportunity to see where what you thought you were going to do and what you are doing are two different things, but all good. How would I answer that question? When I was a kid, well, maybe kid's a bit of a stretch. When I was in my teens, the two things that I aspired to be were a journalist and weirdly a producer on the Children's Television Workshop, which made Sesame Street. So I was obsessed with Sesame Street and how it worked and why it was so sticky for kids. So yeah, those are the two things. So now I'm obviously not doing either of those things, and I have largely built my career in human resources and in people, mostly at tech companies, but also at a big retailer in Canada. I'm in Canada, and an airline.
Very nice. I mean, it sounds like very creative roles, and I would argue that a lot of creativity and innovation is happening in this people space and continues to happen in terms of strategy. You fast forward to now, how do you think your personal journey has really led you up into this point to be specifically at Descartes Labs, but also leading the people function as head of people?
Oof. I would say that I started off in operational roles and quickly kind of had an affinity or an interest in people and how people work and what makes them do great work. And so that's kind of how I ended up on the people side of it. If I look back at my career, I think that most of my decisions to join companies have been about following specific people. Mm-hmm. And particularly following leaders that I felt like were going to push my thinking around change and innovation and doing things differently. So I think that's how I've ended up where I am today. With maybe one exception, it's always been a choice to follow someone that I've worked with before. So that's the case at Descartes Labs as well.
Very nice. I think that's something that I've also heard throughout these conversations as well, especially with work. The people you surround yourself, your manager, and the folks that you're working with have a really big impact on your day-to-day. And there's been a large conversation around really creating an inclusive workspace for everyone, especially if you are in a hybrid role, you're in person, or you're remote first. How can, in your opinion, companies really prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, kind of similar to Revno goals? And how do you do that at Descartes Labs?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'd say we're not doing it very well at the moment. And I can kind of come back to that. I think, I don't think there's an easy answer to this question. I think that there has to be a mindset change in organizations. So in my experience, every organization is faced with a competition of priorities, right? Because you can't do everything and you have limited money. And I think often we either intentionally or unintentionally prioritize incorrectly. And so a good example of this is, thinking about leadership development and the long-term kind of journey that represents and the lack of priority people often put on it because it isn't the current day burning platform. And so I think, with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion, for sure, as a start, it has to be part of your top line goals. But I think that there's even a deeper challenge, which is you have to have the discipline, because I believe so much related to diversity, equity, and inclusion means that you have to trade off other things, right? So you may not be able to hire as quickly as you would like to. And I think most companies, and this was maybe exposed quite a bit last year, will say it's important, but in the end, every day, they're not making the decision to forego something in order to pursue diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think there's a no easy answer kind of discipline that's required in organizations to do that. But certainly it helps to have it as part of your top line.
Yeah, it has to be a priority. If everything is a priority, then nothing is. So it needs to be at the top line, as you were talking about, just like with revenue goals and really tracked as well. I mean, we know there's no kind of golden standard right now. It's always a dynamic process. You should always be working towards, creating that inclusive space. But when you're thinking about, the journey of Descartes Labs, but also just other companies, are there metrics of success that you look to say, okay, we're doing a good job, we still need to make progress, but this is a good marker?
Yeah, I kind of think about the measurement piece in three buckets. So the first is what you traditionally think of as measurement around DEI, which is the kind of absolute numbers related to demographic identities. So, how many women do we have in leadership, as an example? So I think that's one. I mean, I think the hard part about that is that from my perspective, diversity is really about, and I don't mean this to sound like I'm trivializing people, but it's really about the mix of people in an organization, right? And so we almost need a new measure that really takes into account what the mix of the organization is of people, versus I think the absolute numbers of demographic identities are useful directionally to understand the organization, but probably not ultimately what you want to measure. I think the second piece is there needs to be some sort of qualitative measure, right? And right now, the best way we have to do that is through surveys that ask people, and focus groups that ask people, what's your experience as an individual in this organization? Taking into account all the demographic identities people may have. I think the third piece, which is not accessible to every organization because it can be expensive, is to have a third party come in and start to measure in different ways some of the structure that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion in the organization. So, for example, pass-through rates in a recruiting process, or more detailed information about a promotion process that we don't always have the ability to assess ourselves, for a whole bunch of reasons, including privacy, but a third party can help give more perspective on that, I think. But again, there's you kind of have to advance in all three of those measurement buckets. And I think we could all be served by somebody, probably not me, because I don't think I'm smart enough to do this, but coming up with some better measures that are taking more into account that kind of relationship of people in the organization. And
I think that qualitative and quantitative data is really important, working with kind of a third party to get those metrics, and also understanding that they can also shift and change depending on the demographic of your organization, especially as you continue to grow. And you kind of mentioned something along these lines earlier as well, but you've shared in the past, not everyone will win in the transition to more equitable and inclusive organizations. Let's stop pretending otherwise. Can you walk us through what you meant by that in terms of your philosophy around, equitable workplaces?
Yeah, I'd say it's not a particularly popular viewpoint, but I think certainly when I started doing work in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, there was very much this approach that was contextualized by this idea of unconscious bias, and how talking about prejudice and discrimination and bias in the context of it being unconscious was, there were some reasons for doing that. One of them was it makes it easier for people to kind of confront the fact that they may be biased, right? Because it kind of creates this tone that it's not within our control or knowledge. And I understand that, right? If you think about how you drive change, you certainly want in most cases to be able to say it's a win-win kind of situation to do it this way. And I think if you look at organizations as a whole, there are win-win reasons to have a more diverse and equitable and inclusive organization because of some of the data that says those organizations are more successful. I think that when it comes to an individual level, meaningful change from my perspective always comes at a cost. And so if you want to drive towards an organization that has more representation from underrepresented groups, more people from underrepresented groups in leadership, I think it's dishonest to say that we're going to be able to maintain the status quo and have more representation. It's just not possible. So I think that there is a cost to it, and it's a cost that we have to learn to be okay with, because historically there's been a cost as well, right? So, you know, I've had some very interesting conversations with people that I know well that are terrific HR leaders who are finding themselves, when they're looking for a job, shut out of certain searches for head of leadership for HR in different organizations, because the organization is trying to have a more diverse leadership team. And it's really tough for them as individuals, but that's essentially what's happened for hundreds of years, right? Like, there's been, when people say they're against affirmative action, I laugh, because I'm like, affirmative action has been happening forever. It's just been happening in favor of certain groups and not other groups. And so, and we haven't called it that, right? So, you know, last year, when there was a lot of focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I saw a lot of organizations making pledges around this, the question is, and I think the question was asked repeatedly on social media, no, but what cost or what investment are you making in this, right? So if you're on a board of directors and it's an all-white board of directors, and you choose, and you're saying you're in support of this, then step down. Mm-hmm. Like, then get off the board of directors. I think there's a time and a place for now for those of us who've been in the power positions to step back. And I think that's where we have to come to terms with, it's not going to be a win-win, because mm-hmm. there's only one CEO in an organization, right? And if you want that CEO to be somebody from an underrepresented group, it means somebody else has to step back. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer.
Oh, no, I appreciate the context around that, because I don't think that we talk about this perspective enough around, just in order to make change, like you said, there needs to be kind of a cost there. And, you know, it's not all fluffy in terms of tangible ways to make a difference. Hard decisions need to be made on a personal level, on a company level as well. And the status quo should not, you know, continue as it is, if you will. So I'd appreciate the context and details around that as well, not a long answer. Something that I also know that you're really passionate about is gender equality. We've talked a lot about representation. A lot of folks have started, you know, adding their pronouns to their bio signatures and embedding it into their introductions. What are some kind of other ways or day-to-day changes someone can make tomorrow to really promote inclusivity and gender equality, no matter what role they hold in an organization as well?
Yeah, you know, I would say that, like, my side nonprofit initiative has for a long time been focused on gender equality, but increasingly, you know, I would broaden that equality for everyone. I think on a day-to-day basis, the stuff that I'm thinking about now is kind of how do I amplify and how do I advocate? So in an organization, if you are somebody who's been in a power position for whatever reason, either because of your demographic identity or because you have a formalized power position in the organization, whose voice are you amplifying? So, this concept of talking less and helping others talk more is something that I'm really trying hard to do. And also, who are you putting out in front so instead of me, say, agreeing to be on a panel for a conference, who can I put forward from my organization to to do that instead of me? So this concept of stepping back a little bit, but stepping back so you can help support someone to step forward. I think that advocacy in an organization is really important, and it's hard to do because we're so ingrained in our own experience of the organization that we aren't necessarily thinking about other groups and other people. But if you have power in an organization, however big or small, your job is to speak up for others because there's less risk for you to do that. Asking hard questions of leaders in the organization and of yourself. And I guess the other thing is every day doing the work, right? I think the learning piece is really important at an individual level. And that means not waiting for kind of formal opportunities in the organization to deepen your understanding of all the issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that's work you've got to be doing on a daily basis. So those are all things that I think that I'm thinking about right now as it relates not only to gender equality, but inclusion generally.
Yeah, I think inclusion in general too. I mean, we're talking a lot around power dynamics and the role that leaders have as well to really advocate, and especially people managers do, for their team, and really pay attention to who's speaking the most at a meeting. Who am I promoting? Why am I promoting them? And really operationalizing equity into, your thought process, mindset, and decisions, because at the end of the day, you do have a lot of power over that. I know kind of as a leader, a lot of folks are reimagining how they lead more vulnerably, more empathetically. An important piece of that is the internal work. So asking yourself those questions. Is there, in your opinion, a different way we should be measuring kind of the effectiveness of like a people manager at work, that's maybe baked into a performance review, or thought about as something that people should strive towards? Are there any KPIs that you think about?
Yeah, I'd say, this is another area that is not evolved to the point of where it probably needs to be. I think that, I would say that historically, the way we've measured leadership hasn't really been effective. I would also say that the idea that we can define what great leadership looks like is a very ineffective way to think about leadership. And part of that issue is that, I mean, it is easier to measure leadership if you can say, this is what a leader looks like in this organization. They have these qualities, and now we're going to have people assess them against those qualities. I just don't think, and I think this goes against this idea that we get sold in HR and in by the leadership development industry, that there is this way to define what the best leader looks like. And I just don't think, I think ultimately the best leader is one that can adapt an employee experience to each person on their team individually. If we're going to tell people that being unique and difference in organization is important, which is essentially what we're doing when we talk about DEI, then we better be able to craft an employee experience that is adapted to the unique needs of each person in the team. So I don't think I have a good solution on how to measure this. I would say, there's obviously information that comes through in things like engagement surveys and feedback that comes up. but I don't think that there's a great way to do it. We're experimenting a little bit right now with twice a year, we ask employees to complete 5 questions about their manager. And they're very practical questions. So it's not about assessing somebody against a bunch of competencies. It's asking questions like, when you have a problem, does this person make time to help you overcome that problem? How much do you think your manager is invested in your career development? So questions like that have a very practical aspect to them. But that's not a super comprehensive understanding of leadership, I would say.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes sense. There's no magic formula or playbook to be a great manager, but understanding that you have to get that constructive feedback from your team and create that personalized experience, like you said, is important, especially for everybody. Every person, every human is different. But I want to talk about the how in terms of, as head of people, how do you think about creating that differentiated employee experience under the umbrella of one company, one mission, and there are only so many hours in the day, and as your team continues to grow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I hate to make it sound like it depends on every individual, but even this concept, like I think early in my career, I was taught in tech organizations, you needed to have people who were very closely aligned with the purpose of the organization. And, there was a very popular business book at the time that talked about people who didn't fit should be ejected, like amoebas or something. I can't remember the exact analogy, but I think we have to question that idea, because I think even this concept of a mission-driven organization is going to really be different depending on the individual. So, I think we are doing work right now in the organization to understand who we are as an organization. So what are kind of the things that are important to us as an organization, certainly as it relates to people. So, one aspect at Descartes Labs is we have a lot of people who are scientists. So scientific integrity is really important to the organization, and trying to understand then how we weave that into the ways that we're making decisions is important. But I do think, again, you have to put the onus back on managers and support them to do this, to create personalized experiences. I think this concept that we can't do this particular thing for this person because then everybody in the organization is going to want to do that. That's a very old school HR approach to things that I think is just not reasonable now. But back to your question, I think you do need to know who you are as an organization, right? Because just like we talked about prioritizing stuff, that all filters into, what is the personality of this organization? What things matter and what things don't matter? And every time you go from one organization to the other, you do register differences in how the organization relates to certain things and what it prioritizes and doesn't prioritize. And so I think you need to be intentional about that stuff.
Yeah, intentionality, authenticity is key, being genuine and having kind of a North Star of values and mission, and understanding of what the organization stands for is important, and trickles down to decision making, hiring, and a lot of impactful business decisions. Is there anything that came out of like a focus group that you were either surprised by, or something that you're like, this is definitely actionable, I'm glad that we hosted this because now I can change XYZ?
Yeah, I think there's certain, the thing that I found in focus groups most useful is just the perspective people have on standard things that are happening in the organization, but the narrative or the story they have around that. So the why, I think, in focus groups often comes up, and I'm surprised by what their definition of the why is. And I think that that's an absence of us communicating better the reasons behind certain things. I'd say there's a recent thing that was not a surprise, but is maybe a more practical application of feedback, in that we made a decision for July and August to do free Fridays. So Fridays off, no work. And we have been debating at the leadership team about whether to continue this in some way. And, finally we got to the point, like, I don't know why we didn't think of this earlier, but it was like, why don't we just ask people what they want to do? We were trying to figure out whether we're going to, like, whoa, wow, what an idea. And so that's been very interesting, because I think everybody had this fear that if we asked the employee population, that they would be like, yes, Friday's off. But you know what? It was a much more mixed perspective on it, right? Which is, we love it, but now we're trying to jam every meeting into 4 days, and that feels stressful. So that's probably a good practical application of getting feedback. And maybe that's, to your point, the key, which is stop thinking about feedback as being engagement surveys and other things like that, and think about very specific kind of circumstances where you need some practical input on something.
Yeah.
I
think it's definitely important, if you are, wondering what people are thinking, to always kind of ask as well. And you might not get the response like you were talking about that you might have imagined or hypothesized, a much more nuanced kind of answer there. I mean, a lot of people are talking about asking for feedback. They're changing a lot of pieces of their strategy. So they want to know if employees are seeing value in this as well. Business as usual, and this is the way things always have been done, is really thrown out the window. Are there any other kind of ways you want to share how, Descartes Labs has innovated over this past year in terms of your people strategy?
Ooh, would I say that we've innovated? I would not. So prior to me joining, we didn't really have a people strategy.
Okay.
So there's been a lot of building blocks that we've needed to put in place. And I don't know, I think I would not describe what we've done as innovative. I would describe it as responsive. So we've tried really hard to listen to what people were saying and then respond. I don't know if that always feels great, because, I think sometimes people would prefer us to be proactive versus reactive. But I think, the willingness for us to have a conversation around things like Free Fridays is unusual for most leadership teams. I mean, we went virtual first right when the pandemic started, and we're continuing that. So we have what's called a deliberately distributed organization. And I think things like that, I found the leadership team to be super open to considering, versus some organizations I've been in, not. So maybe a little bit of innovation in that sense. I mean, the only other thing that I would call out that has been something that, this is the other thing. I think we tried a lot of stuff, and if it doesn't catch on, then we stop it, right? So we pilot things. One of the things that we piloted as a way to connect people when they are virtual, but also as a way to expose people to people they might not normally meet in their network, is we have this series called Lived Experiences, where we invite people to come and talk about their personal lived experiences, which is how I got connected to you. So that has been very popular. And so that's maybe one way that we've done a little baby innovation that we've tried and it worked. But, for everyone like that, there's stuff that we tried that didn't work. So.
Yeah, absolutely. You try things, you see what sticks, you see what people really latch on to as well, and constantly kind of innovating. And, I think it's definitely a journey. Is there anything that you are looking forward to as well, whether it's people specific or organization specific, or just in general? You can keep it broader, whatever you comes to mind.
Yeah. I'm maybe less interested in this than some people, because I'm a bit of an introvert, but I know that a lot of people in our organization, we've tentatively planned a in-person offsite at the end of January, although that may be in jeopardy now. But I think there's a lot of people looking forward to that. And I am certainly looking forward to spending time connecting with people in the organization, just at a social level. I think that's probably the thing that we're most focused on right now as an organization.
I think that's exciting. I definitely look forward to in-person meetings with my team, especially since AllVoices is remote first as well. So I would definitely be excited for that. Heidi, is there anything that I either didn't ask you that you want to share, or one to two key takeaways that you hope listeners bring with them after listening to our conversation?
No, nothing. I don't think anything comes to mind. I think for people practicing or working in the area of DEI, I'd say, yeah, really think about what are some of the trade-offs you need to make as an organization, or what are you willing to do in the service of DEI to make inroads in that area, is what I would say. It's a ongoing conversation.
Definitely a big question to ask, but an important one when you're doing this work. Thank you so much for being on and sharing your insights with us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you for having me and letting me ramble on.
Absolutely not rambling at all. As a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in that employee feedback management, and we know it's a requirement for the company to succeed on a whole. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.